Welcome to another episode of the Clever Dev. Today we have a material UI table and it has delete functionality for the rows, and we can also edit the data in the row cells. So if you're interested in learning how I added this functionality, then stick around. Here we are in the code for the table that I just showed in the intro, and as usual I've got quite a bit of code already in place that's not relevant to the core of this video. So I've got an interface here. We are using TypeScript. I've got a little bit of styling in place, nothing too exciting. If you want a deeper intro on the table, I've got a couple of videos about it on my channel, and I dive into things like the subcomponents inside the table, so do check those out if you want to dive deeper into that. But for now, I'm just going to keep going on what I have in place. I have my data, and I've actually got it in an array that's using React useState, and there's a reason for that, and we'll get into it. It helps with our deleting of rows and having the table re-render when we delete, so that's why it's here instead of just in its own array outside of the actual functional component. So here we have our table container, table, typical subcomponents. I've got my table head. We're not going to add any functionality at the table head. It's all going to be in the table body. So here we have our table body. I'm iterating through the rows array using map to render the exact same code on each iteration. So on each iteration, we are rendering this table row with these table cells. So what we're going to focus on is actually the table cell. This is where we're going to add functionality. So there's kind of a design decision that I made. We could have either added an edit button in a component cell, let's say at the end of each row, or we can have the table become editable on a click of a cell. So in this case, that's what I chose, is when they click into a particular cell, then that cell becomes editable. That means that a lot of my click handlers, for example, and a lot of my code will be right here inside of the table cell. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add editability to the first table cell for this video, just to keep it not too long. I won't do the same for all of the rest of the table cells in the body, but it would be the exact same idea for each one. So anyway, then our delete will be down here. I've got this empty table cell, and we'll add a delete button to that. But first we'll do the editing. So in order to add editing, what I want to do is when they click this cell, then I want to track both the row index, and we can see that value here, and the column index, you could say. Material UI tables don't really have columns. You see that none of these subcomponents have column in the name. The data grid is very focused on columns, the MUI data grid, but the MUI table is actually all about rows and cells. However, it's useful, of course, to think about columns sometimes, and so for this table cell, this is the first table cell that gets rendered on each row, so you can really think about it as almost taking the place of a column, since its behavior is repeated. So this will be our index of 0 column. So anyway, with that said, let's add some state values up here. So we need a row index and a column index state value in order to properly track what has been clicked. So I will say row index and set row index. And we'll say that equals react.useState. And for now, I'm going to assign this a value of -1. And the reason for that is because by default, I don't want any cell in an edit state. So if I set this to 0 and 0, then our table would likely render with the very first table cell in the very first row in an editable state. So not what we want. So anyway, that's why those -1s are there. Now let's take these values and go down to our first table cell here. Before we explore the code for creating an editable state on our table cell, then I want to mention that I have a link to a post where I have all this code, and that link is in the video details, so you can copy paste this and get some more screenshots, dive deeper into the code, and so on. I also have a link to a Udemy course on advanced material UI component styling, and I have that link in the video details as well. I released that course just fall of 2022. So if you want to gain excellence at styling MUI components, really learn the system that MUI uses so that you can approach any component and have deep knowledge of how MUI styles it, and you can customize it as you need, then definitely check out that course. We dive deep into the SX prop, also the theme, styled components, the syntax behind those. We dive into some of the more advanced components like I include the table, but also the data grid and the grid. We dive deep into layout and spacing and just really getting your MUI app exactly customized how you want it. And so what we want to do is when this is clicked, we need to let the state values know that they need to have a new value. We need to let them know what was clicked. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say set row index. So we're using our setter that we just created. And the value that I'm going to give it is this index. So if the third row first cell gets clicked, then it will just know its index value from what iteration it was on of rows. So we've got that, and I'm just going to keep this click handler really simple. And here what we need to do is we are in our first cell, so that's kind of like our first column, so we can actually just hard-code a value of 0 there. Every time that this particular table cell is clicked, whether it's first row, second row, etc., it's going to have a column index of 0. So we are done with our click handler at the cell level. But what we need to do now that our table is aware of which row and column was clicked, or at least if the first column was clicked, we'd have to add this same onClick to each of these table cells if we wanted them to also, we just change the column index. So not going to do that in this video, but it would be pretty straightforward to do that. So what we need to do now is when this particular cell in, let's say, the first row or second row or whatever is clicked, we need to change what it renders. The approach that I'm going to take, and there's probably multiple ways of doing this, but what I'm going to do is I am going to populate a text field when this particular cell is clicked. And so then that text field will, of course, be editable because that's what text fields do. And when the cell is clicked out of, or if they press enter, then it just simply renders whatever the proper data is, in this case row.name. So we only want to render that text field when the row index is equal to our index value and when our column index is equal to 0. So once again, these were our state values that we mentioned above. And so what we're going to do is we're going to have just like a ternary on this. And since I already have row name in there, because we were just rendering the plain text before, then I'm going to keep that value as the alternative. And what we've got here then is a text field. So let's give it a moment, make sure that our compiler is happy with this. And I think it actually is. Yep. So now we've got our text field in place. Now we need to add some props to it in order to have the proper functionality. But before we do that, then I think we can flip over to our app and make sure that this is all working just fine. All right. So I can, in fact, click into this. Now, there's some things going on that we want to fix or enhance, really, you could say. When I click into this, the text field is not aware of what the particular cell value should be or was. And we don't have a way beyond clicking into another cell to make the text field no longer render. And if I change the data in here, then it's obviously not saving. So basically, we haven't done anything yet. But we'll be able to fix this up with really some pretty straightforward code here. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm actually going to add a default value. And what I'm going to do with that is I'm just going to say rows, index, and name. So let's go examine our row data again. So we've got our rows. I said go find the particular index of that particular row and then grab the field value for the field of name. And so that should get a default value in there. Now our text field is simply aware of what the row value is before I've done any editing or anything like that. Now, the next thing that we need to do is we need to actually give it a change handler. So we'll say on change, and we will say, we'll pass in event. That's pretty basic for a text field. And then what I'm going to do here is I am going to actually use a handler for this one. And the reason for that is because I'm going to pass in a couple of things that are important here. So we're going to pass in our index, our row index, and we're going to pass in the field name. So for this cell, it's okay to hard code that, or better yet would be to have a const, but because this table cell always corresponds to name. Doesn't matter the row, this particular cell is always the first column, so to speak. It's always looking for the name field. So I can hard code that, pass that in. And then finally, we're going to get the value from the whatever the change was. So that's event.target.value. A lot of the material UI components, probably just a lot of HTML components more broadly, they each kind of have their own quirky way of grabbing value. Sometimes in MUI, the value has to be accessed like this. Sometimes, I think like checkboxes, for example, the value is passed directly. You don't have to dig into the event. So it's just kind of like experience and learning and looking at the docs to figure out what you got to do to grab the value. Okay, so now we have told it there's going to be this handler, but obviously it does not actually exist yet. So let's go up here and add in this handler. So I'm going to add it right down here, and I will say const handle text field change. And what we'll do is we'll say row end. I'm just going to call it row end. I like to have very descriptive names usually. However, I don't want to conflict or make any confusion with our state value up here. So I'll say row end, and then I'll say call name. And what we're going to do right here is I'm going to inform it that the value will always be name. If we add functionality to additional columns or to additional cells, then I would want to do something like this. I'd want to say name, and then I'd want to say calories. I'd want to inform it about all the different keys in our rows, in the objects that populate our rows, which are of type food. So I'd want to give it the ability to be any of those keys, and then that'll satisfy TypeScript. But for now, we can just leave it at name. And then finally, I want the value, which is going to be of type string. So then what we want is our actual functionality, and our functionality is pretty simple. We're just going to say rows, and inside of here, row end, and then call name. So now we're accessing a particular value in rows, but we need to do something to it. Instead of accessing it, we're actually going to update it with whatever value is passed in. So that all looks pretty straightforward. However, I will say that the TypeScript typing was kind of tricky on here. For example, I've got my calories, fat, carbs, protein as string values, even though arguably they should or could be numeric. But the TypeScript typing gets kind of tricky. You get some difficulty accessing the keys if they're not all of the same type, and if our value here is not of type string, then it's difficult to update those values. TypeScript, with good reason, is picky in a more complex scenario like this. So that's why I've got some of my types the way that they are. Anyway, with that said, let's go and look at our text field and see how it's going in here. So now it has the default value in here, so that's good. So let's say pizza ABC. Let's see what happens when I click somewhere else. Awesome, so we can see that our row state value is actually getting updated. So pretty cool. What we need now is to add some kind of click handler. You might not be able to tell, but I'm clicking away. And also, let's say I update hot dogs and I press enter. Nothing happens. So we want to add a little bit more functionality to this. So let's go ahead and get the click away listener. So I've actually already got the imports in here. just keep things straightforward and fast. So what I'm going to do for our click away listener is I'm actually going to wrap the entire table. So this might not be super precise yet. You might need a little bit more precision in where you wrap your click away listener. So let's get that around the container here. However, for example, you may want to just wrap the body so that if they click in the head, then the cells stop being in edit mode. But if they click anywhere in the body, then they have to be clicking on another cell. And so you want, as we've seen, then when we click from one cell in the first column to another, then the original cell knows it's no longer being edited. The new cell knows it needs to be edited. So you might want to fiddle around with where you put the click away listener at. However, the functionality for the click away listener is actually pretty straightforward. All that we care about is on click away. And then we'll have some kind of handler in here. So what we want this handler to do is we would just want it to update the row index and the column index with -1 because we're resetting it to a completely unedited state. I'll say that a different way. We want to have it no longer in an edit state. We do, of course, want to keep whatever edits have already happened. So I'm going to use the same code for both my click away listener and for my enter key press. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually create a handle exit function. And so here in our handle exit, I'll put that right here. And here I will say something pretty simple. Just say set row index to -1, and then same thing, set column index to -1. So that should handle our exit. We'll test that in just a moment. First, since we're on a roll here, I'm going to go ahead and add it to the text field. So what we want to do is we want to add the on key press here. And so we will say that event is getting passed in, and then when event is getting passed in, here's what we'll do. We'll just check on event, and we will say if event.key is equal to enter, then we're going to do the thing. And the thing is handle exit. So that should be all that we need there. Just make sure you have enter capitalized. It is case sensitive, of course, and the appropriate value is enter with a capital E. So pretty cool stuff. Let's go and test all of this now. And so let's say I go to donut, I click away, awesome. We don't have to just click somewhere else on the table. So let's say I change this to pi z and I press enter, awesome. So that's actually the extent of the editing. Like I said, I do not have these values editable, but you could easily take the exact code that I added and add it to any of these cells, any of these other cells, and you'd get the same behavior. So now let's go back to our code. What we want to do now is add that delete. So I've already got the table cell in place, and what I'm going to do down here is I will add a button. So let's do that. I've already got my button import in place as well. And inside of here, I'll just give it text of delete. And I'm going to keep our button pretty simple. Let's add just a little bit of styling. Give it contain. That makes it, I think that's better because it makes it pop a little more visually. And really beyond that, it's just our on click. So let's get this in here. Now with our on click, what we're going to do is, and let me actually format this just a little bit. This is hard to work with as it is. I find that I like to format at the worst possible time when I am kind of like mid something here. Let's give it at least empty brackets so the compiler is a little happier. All right, so we've got all that in place. I probably could have just pressed Control S and it would have auto-formatted for me, but there we go. Anyway, we have our on-click here, and all that we need to do is we need to remove a row from our rows array. So for that, we're going to use the splice function that is built into arrays. And what we need to do is we need to tell it which value to splice, which in this case, we are going to have our delete button in a particular row. We want to delete that row when it is clicked. So we've got index, and then we have a value of 1 here. The value of 1 is just saying that we only want to remove one, the particular item that was, the particular index that was passed to our splice. If we put 2, then it would remove the index plus the next one, the next element in our array. So we don't want that. We just want a simple 1 here. So with that, we should be good to actually have delete functionality in here. So something's not quite working yet. So let's go back to our code and see what that is. Oh, there's one more thing we need to do. We've done our rows splice, and I'm glad that I had that bug because it jogged my memory on this. So we've got our rows splice, but there's one more thing we need to do. Because of observability, then our table is supposed to re-render when the rows state value is changed. However, just doing rows.splice, even though that does change the rows array, like if I put a debugger right here, we'd see that rows is changed. However, that's not enough to trigger the observer to know that some event has happened on what it's observing, which is rows. So what we also need is we need to call setRows. And here we need to pass in, this is important, we need to use the spread operator, and we're going to pass in rows. So there we go, we've passed in a new value. Basically, it's important that we're triggering rows with setRows, or we're triggering the observer with setRows. It thinks it's getting a new value. Essentially it is, but the reason it's truly getting a new value is because we're using the spread operator on the existing rows array. And it is important to use that spread operator, otherwise it will not be enough to trigger the observer to know that a change has happened. So we're actually passing in genuinely a new array here. So now let's take a look. So let's get back to our table cell code now. So that's funny. Coming back here, then we'd already pressed delete on a couple of rows, but our table simply hadn't updated, but it truly was deleting behind the scenes. And so now that we've changed the code, then that made our table re-render. And now it's aware that it did, in fact, lose some records. So now it actually works just fine. And I'll refresh the table, and we can see it in action a little bit better. So pretty cool.